For a moment, it seemed to me that I had lost touch with reality. Kelly's heavy words rang in my head like thunderclaps echoing on a wounded soul. Don't you dare show up at my graduation ceremony. A boring old witch like you will just be everyone's laughing stock. It's my big day, so don't come anyway. His heart felt as if it had been pulled into a steel trap. When she said that, I literally felt the ground beneath me become shaky. Most of all, it hurt to realize that for her I was not a family, not a support, not a person who had protected her since the age of 5. No, I was an embarrassment to her, something unnecessary, annoying. I'm 41 years old now. 13 years ago, I entered this life as Jake's wife and, naively believing that my role was to become a mother to Kelly, I gave her all my warmth, all my care. I saw in her anxious eyes then, on the day we met, pain and fear. She was only 5 years old, and she was hiding behind her father like a small frightened animal, avoiding my gaze. Then I thought that I could win her trust, that years of love and attention would erase her doubts. I left my old life, my job at a construction company, where I met Jake. He was so bright, charming, with a smile that seemed to dissolve the cold around him. His kindness bribed me, his desire to build not only a career, but also a home, a strong, loving home in which we could be happy. But it turned out that happiness is a fragile glass that easily breaks if it is not supported on both sides. My family was against our marriage. My father warned me that I was making a mistake. They will laugh at you, mocking you behind your back, he said when I announced my engagement. But I wasn't listening. I wanted to be with Jake, I wanted to take care of Kelly. At that moment, I believed that I was making the right choice. Years have passed, and what began as a new chapter in my life has turned into a constant struggle. The memories of the first days of marriage now seem like a warm dream. Back then, Kelly was a kind, open-minded girl, gradually getting used to me. But something has changed. At first it was small jabs, minor remarks, and then she started calling me an old witch. I don't remember when I first heard it from her. Maybe it was some random moment that I was trying to justify teenage rudeness, fatigue, the influence of her friends. But it began to repeat itself. Hey, old witch, where's my shirt? Kelly's shrill voice snapped me out of my thoughts. I was standing by the washing machine, trying to remember where I put her favorite thing. Did you steal it? Did you ruin everything again? She continued, not giving me a chance to answer. With difficulty, I found a t-shirt in a neatly folded pile of underwear and handed it to her. Kelly grabbed it with annoyance. Why did you wash it? Couldn't you have given it to the dry cleaners? Do you even understand how this is done? You're so dumb. It was a special cloth. I wanted to explain that I washed it by hand, taking care of the delicate fabric, but the words stuck in my throat. All I could say was, I'm sorry. Kelly snatched the t-shirt out of my hand so abruptly, as if she was afraid I'd change my mind about giving it back. She gave me a look full of contempt and said through her teeth, You're really useless. These words pierced me like shards of glass. I could have objected to something, tried to justify myself, but the usual feeling of powerlessness flooded my consciousness. Instead, I just said, I'm sorry. The words sounded pathetic, as if reflecting all my helplessness. I didn't understand when Kelly started treating me like that. In the early years after Jake's wedding, moving into their house, she was affectionate, if a little withdrawn. I explained her caution to myself by saying that she needed to get used to the new person in the house. Yes, children can be difficult, especially those who have gone through a parent's divorce. I thought they were teasing her, that she felt insecure about her father's remarriage, but in fact it turned out to be much more complicated. Over the years, the relationship in our house began to change. At first, the changes were barely noticeable, almost imperceptible. Jake, always so cheerful and energetic, began to lose his spark. His smile became a rare guest at home, and the kind words he bestowed on me at the beginning of our marriage were replaced by dry and detached phrases. He began to address me simply as "hey" or "you," which sounded cold and unpleasant. At the same time, Kelly's behavior was changing. She seemed to absorb this attitude from her father. Her rudeness increased day by day. The old witch has become her favorite way of addressing me. She didn't thank me for the dinners, for the care, for the endless hours I spent trying to make her life comfortable. At the same time, at school events, her teachers told me how smart, obedient, and respectful she was. This sharp discrepancy between her behavior at school and at home only increased the pain. I tried to talk to Jake, but each time it ended in nothing. He either didn't want to listen, or he reduced everything to my shortcomings. "You're just not doing well. If you had tried harder, everything would have been different," he said, and these words pulled the last of my strength out of me. Sometimes it seemed to me that my husband saw in me not the woman with whom he had tied his life, but just a housewife who was unable to meet his expectations. Every day his nagging became more petty and ruthless. "You can't even dust the stairs. You're a housewife, aren't you? Or where's the toilet paper? Why does it always end?" Such phrases sounded more often than I would like. I apologized as if I was really guilty, even though I knew I was doing my best. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. Jake looked at me with disdain, as if I was someone who had not lived up to his expectations. Once upon a time we had roles that we shared equally. I cooked, he cleaned. I took care of Kelly, he did the hard work around the house. It was our unspoken agreement, but over time, all the responsibilities seemed to fall on my shoulders. I cleaned, cooked, washed, and made sure everything was perfect, but Jake always found something to hold on to criticize me. "You haven't learned anything in all these years," he said, contemptuously looking around the clean but not perfect kitchen. "You can't even do the cleaning properly." These words were like hammer blows on a glass wall, behind which I was trying to hide my resentment. All I could say was, "I'm sorry. I will try. Please forgive me." But inside, I felt like something was breaking inside of me. It was as if a small voice in my head was asking, "How long are you going to put up with this?" Jake sighed heavily, his irritation almost palpable. "Even if you try your best, there's still nothing you can do. You only promise, but you never keep it. That's why they always complain about you." His words cut like a razor. They didn't just leave scratches, they burned everything inside. Over time, I stopped even trying to justify myself. My heart is tired. I'm tired. Kelly turned 18, and I hoped that her attitude towards me would change with age. But instead of sharing her plans for the future with me, she preferred to discuss everything with Jake. Sometimes it seemed to me that I was becoming a ghost in my own house, present, but unnoticeable. One day, as I was passing by the living room, I heard Kelly happily talking to her father. I stopped outside the door, unable to resist the temptation to listen. "It's all settled," she said. "I went to college on your recommendation and even got a scholarship. It's all thanks to you, Dad. Thank you." Her voice was full of sincere joy and gratitude. I couldn't remember her ever speaking to me in that tone. Jake answered, and his words hit like a whip. "Good for you, honey. This is the result of your efforts. It was worth shifting all the housework to that clumsy maid so that you could focus on your studies." The laughter that came after these words was almost cheerful, but there was contempt in it. I pressed myself against the wall, afraid that my legs would not hold me. I quietly left this place and hid in the bathroom. It was the only place in the house where I could feel at least a little protected. Sitting on the edge of the tub, I buried my face in my hands and cried. Tears flowed like a stream, burning my skin. Everything I heard echoed in my head: a clumsy maid, a good way out for stress. So, all these years, I was not a wife, not a mother for them, but just a tool, a means to make their lives easier. But I couldn't afford to give up. I remained Kelly's mother and Jake's wife, despite all this. Every day was a struggle. I got up at first light, cooked breakfast, washed, cleaned. Sometimes I wanted to just lie down and not get up anywhere, but the fear of being completely rejected lifted me up again and again. Sometimes I found myself remembering almost nothing from those days. Everything merged into a monotonous circle of responsibilities. One day, when I was returning from the store, a neighbor, smiling, informed me that Kelly's graduation would be the next day. I froze as if I had been hit. I didn't know about it. Neither Kelly nor Jake told me anything. I forced a smile, thanked the neighbor and left, trying not to show how much it hurt me. When I got home, I collapsed on the couch, feeling a wave of impotence wash over me. Graduation is an important milestone, a moment that I once imagined quite differently. I dreamed how we would celebrate her success together, how proud I would be of her. But reality was far from these fantasies. At that moment, the door slammed and Kelly entered the room. She gave me a quick glance full of annoyance. "Hey, old hag, what are you messing around for? You make the whole house dark and dreary. Can't you do something about it?" I stared at her, trying to find the strength to answer. But the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I just felt something inside me finally crumble. Kelly looked at me with an arrogance that I had long ago learned to recognize in her gaze. She snatched out her t-shirt, as if I should be grateful for the very fact of her presence, and began to leave, leaving a cold trail of words behind her. "You're not coming anyway, so why do you need to know the date?" Those words seemed to sink into my heart. I could feel anger rising deep somewhere, not fierce, but quiet, like rising water in a dark, abandoned basement. Kelly's graduation was supposed to be a moment of pride for all of us, a step into her adult life. Instead, I was once again confronted with her contempt, with a cold reminder that I was nobody in her eyes. I never said I wouldn't go. I tried to object, but Kelly just shrugged her shoulders, as if she didn't care about my opinion at all. She muttered something mocking under her breath and left the room, leaving me in complete silence. Later, when Jake returned home with the suit at the dry cleaners, I realized that he was also part of this conspiracy of silence. He threw the suit on a chair, as if I should have known right away that it was for prom, and said with a sarcastic grin, "I take it Kelly made it clear that you weren't needed." His words were the last blow to my already tortured soul. I looked at him, but I couldn't find the words. All I could feel at that moment was emptiness, thick as quicksand. Kelly and Jake left for the ceremony together. I stayed at home, as always. But something changed that day. If before I just endured, hoping that everything would get better, now I realized that I had reached my limit. I could no longer be a part of their family, which rejected me at every turn. It was not a house, but a cage. My efforts were not appreciated, my feelings were ignored, and all that was required of me was to continue to serve. When they left, I started packing. Every shirt folded in a suitcase, every pair of shoes symbolized a step towards freedom. I wrote a note, short but precise, explaining my decision to end our relationship and asking to discuss the details through a lawyer. It was my way of putting an end to a story that had long ago turned into an endless nightmare. My parents lived 3 hours away from this place, and I knew that was where I needed to go. I imagined getting on a train and leaving this house, this life, this lie behind me. There, at my parents', I planned to start all over again. This house, oddly enough, was built on land owned by my father. The money for the construction was also mostly provided by them, and, in fact, everything, from the foundation to the roof, belonged to my family. It was a wedding gift, for which I was paying a little with my earnings. Jake, of course, didn't know all the details. He probably thought that the house belonged to him and that it was an integral part of his new life. But I knew the truth was completely different. It wasn't easy to leave the house, but it was even harder to stay in it. I knew that now was the time to return it to my father, let Jake and Kelly face the consequences of their actions. When I left, I didn't feel hatred, only fatigue and relief. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. I took a deep breath before pressing the answer button. Kelly's words, half scream, half threat, echoed in my ears. "Hey, old hag, where are you now? How dare you leave such a ridiculous note? Come back right now." Her voice was laced with panic and anger. At that moment, I imagined her returning from graduation, finding an empty house and my note, which destroys her idea of the usual order of things. The panic was building in her voice, and I could almost see her rushing around the house, realizing that everything had changed. Jake's voice could be heard in the background, no less agitated, but much more angry. They were completely at a loss, like children who were suddenly left unattended. It seemed strangely ironic to me. All I did was disappear, leaving them to deal with their ideal life on their own. I held back a grin and said softly, "Who is this?" Kelly seemed taken aback by my calm response. There was a note of surprise in her voice, and she stammered, Are you making fun of me?" "It's me, Kelly. You can't just walk away. Where are you?" I didn't answer right away. Kelly's words, full of hysteria, instead of hurting, caused a strange feeling of relief. It was the first time in many years that I felt like I had control of the situation. For the first time, I wasn't the one who begged, who endured, who accepted the blame for everything. "Kelly," I finally replied, trying to keep my voice firm and calm. "I've done everything I can for you. All. But you didn't notice it. Neither you nor your father. It's over now. You're an adult. It's time for you to take responsibility for your life." There was silence on the other end of the line for a second. Then I heard Kelly scream again, but her screams no longer had any power over me. It was a noise, a meaningless hum that I wasn't going to run away from anymore, but I didn't intend to give in either. Jake's voice cut through the cacophony. "Are you crazy? Come back now. You can't just leave us like this." His habitual aggressive tone only confirmed what I already knew. He wasn't worried about me leaving. He was worried about having to deal with the consequences. "Jake," I said, already feeling the weight of years fall off me. "The house is not yours. I've never been yours. It's a gift from my father, and now he's going back to his family. You both knew that. You have a week to find a new place to live. That's all I can do for you." I heard Kelly scream in horror, and Jake started shouting something unintelligible, but I wasn't listening anymore. I slowly took the phone away from my ear and pressed the end call button. My heart was pounding, but not from fear. It was something new, a strange feeling of relief and freedom, as if I had finally thrown off the shackles that I had worn for too long. I took a deep breath, then another, as if I had tasted fresh air for the first time in years. After I hung up the phone, without hesitation, I dialed the number of the real estate management company to make sure that the demolition would actually begin as planned. They confirmed that the demolition would be tomorrow, and Jake was notified in advance. But I decided to take a break, asked to postpone the demolition to the day after tomorrow, for one day, in order to give them one last opportunity to try to change the outcome of the situation. It was my small consolation to be delayed for one day, as a response to everything they had caused me. When I received confirmation that the postponement had been granted, I put down the phone and felt a strange feeling brewing in my chest. I knew that Jake and Kelly would try to call and come to me. And indeed, the next day their calls did not stop. I decided to ignore them. Let them worry, let them get lost in their worries. They didn't deserve my attention. Every call, every attempt was another attempt to control me, and I couldn't let it go on. At about noon, the doorbell rang. There was a knock. I knew it was them, Jake and Kelly. Judging by how long they didn't show up, They probably tried to get to me faster than expected, but because of the poor train service, they were late. I took my time opening the door, gathering my thoughts and deciding that now I had to be cold and unshakable. When I saw Jake and Kelly approach, I forced myself not to feel either fear or excitement. I'll just open the door, take them into my life, like the cherry on the cake of their own games. When I finally opened the door, their appearance left no doubt. They were in a panic. Jake was breathing heavily, his face was grim, and his eyes darted warily around the room, as if looking for a way out. He seemed like a completely different person from the one he was at the moment when I left them outside, waiting for their reaction. There was a weakness on his face, an almost childish uncertainty. Kelly, on the other hand, looked less upset, but her tension betrayed her desire to keep control of the situation. She wasn't afraid, she was rather ready to fight. I invited them in, arranged them in the living room and sat down opposite myself, setting myself up for a conversation in which I would be the master of the situation. Jake looked nervous until he noticed that my parents were missing. This somewhat discouraged him, and he seemed to feel safe. Now that no one could control his behavior, his arrogance began to surface again. Kelly was different. She immediately sat down in a chair with her arms and legs crossed, crossing them as if she was doing it consciously, preparing for battle. Her body was tense, as if she was ready to grab if the situation got out of control. "Well," she began, radiating annoyance, "what is this all about? How could you do such a thing? Is this a joke? Where were you when we called?" She stuck the note I left right on the table in front of her, as if she was throwing it in her face. I didn't answer, just fixed my gaze on Kelly, making her realize that neither her aggression nor her manipulations would affect me. My silence at that moment said more than words. She couldn't stand it and, embarrassed, looked away, trying to regain control. When she met my eyes again, there was a nervous tremor in her voice. "Listen, you don't think you can beat us, do you? You can't handle this alone, you're just trash, get this," she said with disgust, but there was desperation in her voice. I felt her confidence tremble as she retreated herself, trying to cover her anxiety with aggression. I can't say that I didn't feel a flash of anger at her words, but I tried to suppress this feeling. She wanted to break me, to make me weak, but her words were just an echo of her fear. I knew that holding back emotions would be much more powerful than any reaction. "You don't understand, Kelly," I said flatly, "but you're both not my family. I don't owe you anything. And I certainly won't be coming back." These words weighed heavily on her mind, but she, unwilling to back down, tried to start the conversation again. She wanted to say something, but she couldn't find the words. Jake sat in silence, watching what was happening. He was visibly nervous. All his arrogance disappeared as soon as his eyes met mine. He wondered if he could make any difference. "You can't live without us, like Kelly says," he began, trying to regain control. But his words sounded empty. I realized what a cowardly man he was, how his callousness was exposed in that moment. Over the years, I've tried many times to explain to myself why Jake and Kelly behave the way they do. I was looking for excuses for their actions, hoping that they would change, that I would be able to find in their behavior at least a piece of love or appreciation, which, in theory, should have been embedded in the relationship between close people. But now I was clearly aware that for them I was nothing more than a tool, a means to achieve their goals. They didn't understand what a family was. "I don't have a family," I said firmly, not for a moment doubting my words. "I don't owe anyone anything. I will continue to treat you as outsiders, no matter how much you try to squeeze yourself into my life, no matter how you try to relabel people who don't belong to you. Jake and Kelly are not my family. If they were my family, they wouldn't treat me like a servant, wouldn't keep me silent and serve them in their soulless game." For 12 years, their relationship with me was far from what can be called support. They insisted that this was normal, that this was how it should be, but I could no longer and did not want to tolerate their manipulations. Every year, with every new word they said, I felt my life narrowing, as I became part of their problem, not the solution. It was not a relationship, but an attempt at oppression. It seemed to me that their attitude towards me was something akin to slavery. I couldn't be happy among them, couldn't find satisfaction in their demands. I was supposed to help and support them, but they weren't the ones who would ever support me. I put up with it all until Kelly graduated from high school. I hoped that when she was ready to leave, everything would change. My expectations, as always, were in vain. The dream that one day we would be a real family disappeared into the emptiness of their indifference. Everything was decided the day before her graduation. I suddenly realized that their true face could no longer be hidden. It was the same face that I had to see every day, and it told me that I meant nothing to them. I couldn't afford to be a part of their lives anymore. I looked at them with a completely new attitude. Kelly noticed the change in my gaze and immediately changed her tone. She didn't talk to me as confidently as she used to, didn't try to dominate me. "We're a family, aren't we, Mom?" Her voice was full of despair, as if she suddenly realized that this game would not continue. I could hear the panic in her words. When she said, "Mom," I felt a sharp pain, but this pain was not related to love. It was a bitter realization that she had always been playing with me, always manipulating me, and now she needed to regain control. Jake seemed to be waiting for me to take a step towards their family expectations, but it was too late. As always, he was just a sideline observer who was once again trying to protect himself and his pointless game. He looked at me anxiously, expecting me to change my mind. "You're not my biological mother," he said, trying to reconnect. "But we've been living together all these years, so please listen to me." I leaned forward, no longer hiding my indifference. "I don't have to listen to requests from those who are not a member of my family," I said, this time without holding back my emotions. My heart was a canvas covered with harsh strokes of alienation and bitterness. Kelly didn't seem to expect this from me. Her eyes filled with tears when she finally realized that her manipulations would no longer work. "Please listen to me," she begged, literally screaming in despair. "You're not going to sell the house, are you? You can't do this, you're part of our family, Mom." I felt sickened by her words. She kept assuring me that home was more important than me, that all she needed was a roof over her head, ignoring the fact that I had become someone she had never counted on. It was a moment of truth. I couldn't just stay silent anymore. I asked her what she really wanted. "Is the house important to you, not me? All you're worried about is losing this place, isn't it?" Her words didn't move me, nor did her tears. It wasn't a real worry, it was just her attachment to the facilities I provided for them. Instead of continuing to convince me, Kelly lowered her head and began to cry. I looked at her without any sympathy. It was her decision to be part of this fake family. And now she had to face the consequences. Jake couldn't stand it. He, like Kelly, attacked me. "What kind of joke is this?" His voice was full of rage. "Enough with your disrespect. What's with this note? Come home right now and stop the demolition." I looked at him with restrained emotions, feeling how each of his screams only strengthens my decision. "I'm not coming back. And you can't make me." "I can't, it's already been decided." Those words pierced the space between us like a shot, reflecting the determination that filled me. It's amazing how it took me so long to realize that I no longer belonged to them. I am no longer their prisoner. And when Jake, with insane irritation, shouted, "Do you think you can do this to your family and get away with it?" his words couldn't shake me anymore. I didn't feel threatened, I didn't feel afraid. All I saw was weakness, a hysterical attempt to keep me in this tedious, destructive relationship. I answered calmly but firmly, "I keep telling you that you're not my family." These words were uttered without a shadow of doubt. And no matter how hard Jake and Kelly tried to look confident, no matter how they tried to make me doubt their rightness. It was clear to me that my words were not just a reprimand, this was a decision that I had made over these years of silence and suffering. But they didn't seem ready to hear it. Neither Jake nor Kelly looked like they were going to back down. Their faces were distorted with bewilderment, perhaps from confusion. Perhaps they expected me to give in again, to become their servant again, their convenient tool for manipulation. But I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't deceive myself, couldn't believe in their false promises and empty apologies. I knew that they had never seen me as a real part of their family. I was just a resource for them, someone who would serve, take care of, support, but not someone who could count on reciprocity. And then Jake suddenly stood up and slammed his fist on the table. The noise was deafening, and for a second the air became tense, like a string about to break. I was shocked, but I restrained my emotions, despite the desire to explode with anger. His aggression, his loss of control, seemed to release all the pain that I had been suppressing for a long time. And at that moment, I felt a cold rage begin to accumulate in my body. "Don't mess with me," his voice was full of rage. But I didn't back down. I felt a determination creep into my voice, as the sound of each word became firmer. "Check who's messing around. You haven't treated me like a family member for 12 years. Now you can't suddenly act as if everything was normal." My voice sounded sharper than I expected, and this spontaneous aggravation was inevitable. Anger boiled inside me like volcanic lava, and I could barely keep myself from bursting out all this storm of emotions. At some point, it seemed to me that I couldn't take them anymore. All those years that I lived restlessly among them, hoping for something more, turned out to be a waste of time. I was tired of their indifference, tired of their manipulations, of how they dragged me into their abyss, and they continued to think that I would always be there, that I would endure. But now I knew I couldn't do it anymore. "It's impossible," I said restrainedly, although my inner "I can't" has long since broken through. They should have realized that this was the last straw for me. I grinned, a bitter smile spreading across my face. Kelly and Jake froze, their eyes showing shock. It was something they hadn't expected. There was a dazed look in their eyes, as if they were only now realizing that I had finally broken down. And even if it's hard for me to admit it, I knew that during these 12 years I really tried to become their family, tried to be more than just a duty for them. But now I saw that I couldn't waste any more energy or time on people who didn't appreciate me. Jake seemed to have lost all his strength. His body sank into the chair, and he was unable to understand what had happened. These two have never been able to understand my feelings, my pain. They used me, exploited me, as if I were just a tool, a part of their life, but not a part of their heart. I cared about Jake and Kelly, I wanted to be with them, but in their eyes I was never anything more than just a comfortable person. I was the servant, and they were the masters. And now that they were having problems, they were trying to use me again, pretending to be a caring family, which they really weren't. My body was filled with not just a headache, but also nausea. Why did I put up with these people for 12 years? Why did I keep hoping for something impossible? Looking back, I felt like all these years had turned into a pointless struggle with windmills. And so, when I realized that I couldn't go on anymore, I put a piece of paper in front of Jake. It was a divorce form. I had already found it, prepared it in advance, knowing that this moment would come sooner or later. "Sign this form, Jake." "I'll serve it myself," I said, leaving no room for discussion. Jake looked at me, his eyes full of surprise. He shook his head vigorously, but then forced a barely perceptible smile. He was trying to smile, as if I might change my mind, as if there might be something that would force me back into his world again. But I already knew, his words, his attempts to manipulate, it was all pointless. We were on different shores, and this bridge between us burned down. Okay, I was shocked at how bad it was. My mind couldn't immediately grasp the depth of what was happening. Jake was at the end of our life together, and it was as if I stood in the center of this collapsing world, invisible to everyone, but no longer able to stop this process. He, so narrow-minded and pathetic, all these years continued to use me to be his shadow, his convenient figure, who will always be there, who will always endure. And now that his world had collapsed, he still couldn't figure out exactly what he had done wrong. I've always misunderstood Jake's ingratiating smile. The smile he showed me when we first met was a sloppy expression of underestimating someone, an assessment that rather reflected his own emptiness, his desire to seem like something he wasn't. I took it for the smile of a kind person who thinks about others, and now I realized how deeply I was mistaken. That smile was nothing more than a mask. And now, looking back, I couldn't help the anger that rose in my chest, tearing it apart with every memory of those days when I trusted him, when I thought he really cared. I stood up, and at that moment I felt a cold surge of determination. I couldn't sit and watch any more of this. I called my parents, and as if on cue, they entered the living room. At that moment, something in the atmosphere changed. Jake's mouth dropped open, as if his jaw had dropped. It was ridiculous, but to some extent very typical of him. How often have I seen such a reaction when he felt threatened? He was defenseless, his cunning tricks did not work. He even stuttered, trying to say something, but couldn't find the words. My father, who was used to such moments, glared at Jake. Strict, unaffected, he was ready to meet this man, who had deceived me and the whole family so much, with a look that could crush. My mother also joined in this silent attack, her eyes full of anger and frustration, leaving no chance for excuses. "I'm sorry," Jake began, his voice filled with despair, but I could feel only emptiness behind those words. He kept mumbling, and I made Kelly apologize the same way he did. I was pretty sure her apologies didn't matter, and neither did his. They were both helpless, their regrets unable to turn back the destructive path they had traveled. "Am I bothering you because of Lisa?" I thought I misheard. Did he dare to claim that my act was that I left home alone? My action was that Jake, despite all his cruelty, was still trying to evade responsibility for his actions. My father's eyebrow twitched, but he was silent. His silence was scarier than any violent reaction. He knew that words meant nothing to people like Jake. Lisa. Well, she left home alone, so I was just trying to convince her to come back, right? Jake continued, his voice getting more and more nervous. And at that moment, I realized that he still did not realize the gravity of his actions. He also tried to shield himself, to make himself look like a martyr, as if he was the only one who tried to bring me back. Kelly, for her part, agreed with his ridiculous statements, like at that moment when she didn't think about anything but herself, even when she had to extort money from a schoolgirl. My father, having no patience to listen to all this, barked, "Don't mess with me." His voice echoed through the house, and the windows shook with his might. Jake and Kelly froze, stunned by the roar, but that wasn't all. The father stood in front of them, meeting their gazes, and said, so loudly and clearly that they could not help but be shocked, "How can you say that Lisa behaved selfishly? You're only thinking about yourself. You really are a petty person." It wasn't just a speech, it was a verdict. A turn of events that they clearly did not expect. But the meeting did not end there. My father turned to Kelly, and his gaze was so stern that it seemed he could tear her apart. "You've done terrible things too, Kelly. What do you think of Lisa?" "You did it again," he shouted loudly again, and Kelly must have been barely restraining herself from fear. Her body began to tremble, and she could not utter a word. She knew that the truth about her had been revealed. "You extorted money from a schoolgirl, didn't you?" my father continued, and Kelly turned pale. She exclaimed with wide eyes that it couldn't be true, that she didn't believe what she had heard. But my father knew. We hired a private investigator, and it turned out that her crimes were not limited to just that. She was extorting money, and the victim was too scared to tell anyone. However, My father did not leave her chances by organizing a criminal complaint. When I saw their reaction, I realized that they had completely misunderstood who they were facing. It wasn't just my struggle. It was a war with their false essence, and now they felt how it really was. They probably didn't pack their bags, thinking they could convince me that it wasn't that bad, that everything could be fixed. I hesitated, not knowing whether to tell them the truth, but the moment Kelly suddenly said something incredible, I realized that, perhaps, I should no longer leave the slightest doubt. She spoke with such a pout, as if she was absolutely sure she was right. But this divorce was initiated by you, right? Mom, Dad, you have to get alimony, she said, as if putting an end to some kind of legal dispute. Kelly must have been desperate. Her face was distorted by emotions, which, however, did not show the slightest trace of remorse. My parents looked shocked, and I just felt everything around me become empty and burdensome. It was impossible not to see this as a manifestation of complete indifference and dishonesty on their part. What they had done could not be justified. They destroyed not only my life, but they themselves were destroyed, although they did not realize it until the end. "This is impossible," my father exclaimed, his voice trembling with anger. "What you two have done is outright domestic violence and crime." His words echoed through the room, but Kelly, like Jake, didn't react properly. I knew that they were trying to justify themselves by ignoring the facts, because all they had left was to fight for themselves, without the slightest thought for others. I chuckled. "Evidence?" I said with cold determination, picking up the notebook and placing it on the table in front of them. "This is the diary I've been keeping since we got married." Kelly stared at me with a mocking expression, as if it was just a small thing. "You don't even have a smartphone or computer. What proof can you have?" Her voice sounded dismissive, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes that she tried to hide. "You don't seem to know that a diary can be significant evidence," I explained calmly. "Not only videos, audio and photographs are considered evidence. There are other ways to fix the truth." Kelly looked dumbfounded, and I could feel her confidence melting like ice under the hot sun. "Yes, our lawyer also agreed that this diary is valid evidence," I added, feeling the air in the room become dense, heavy with revealed secrets. Jake and Kelly finally lowered their heads, as if in recognition of their defeat. I almost felt sorry for them, but I quickly pushed the feeling away. They deserved every blow that came their way. I looked at my wristwatch exaggeratedly, as if to emphasize the point. "The last train has already left," I said with cold satisfaction in my voice. "I don't think you can come home tonight." The mother watched this with a smug expression on her face, and her silence was like the final chord of the whole scene. "Yes, and there are no taxes here either," she added, as if this was important for further developments. I wondered if there's even a decent hotel nearby. I thought, but I didn't say it out loud. My parents were no less determined than I was, and our goal was clear: they had to leave. We weren't going to connect our lives with these people anymore. "Well, our business here is over," my mother said, her voice so firm that I felt a little relieved. We kicked Jake and Kelly out of the house, and I watched them slowly leave, not believing what was happening. They probably couldn't believe it had ended like this. The last train left so early, and I was standing at the second-floor balcony watching them rush to the station. There was not the confidence in their backs that they had once demonstrated. Now their steps were hurried, uncertain, and I saw their downfall. Everything that had been accumulating inside me now began to flow away like sand through my fingers. I felt the weight go away, and although there was still something left to tie up, it didn't matter anymore. All I needed was to see them leave and realize that this was really the end. Jake and Kelly missed the last train and couldn't get a taxi. I knew that the next day they would have to walk to the hotel, and their lives would be completely different. When they arrived at the hotel, the demolition of their house had already begun. They had nothing but their clothes. I didn't care. I temporarily stored furniture, appliances, and my personal belongings in a warehouse, but I didn't tell them about it. It was my little consolation, even though I didn't feel guilty. I had already received a report from a lawyer that the divorce was finalized, and now Jake had to pay alimony. He didn't want to pay, but his company put pressure on him. A private investigator reported that Jake had been fired for embezzlement, and I couldn't help but feel a certain satisfaction from that. Kelly, in turn, could not avoid the consequences of her actions. She contacted the police, but it didn't save her. She was expelled from college, and her reputation was ruined. The whole story has become a lesson that both of them don't seem to have learned. Jake, impoverished and exiled, could only afford to rent a small, old apartment far from the station, where he now lived with Kelly, who had dropped out of school. Every week they quarreled with each other, blaming each other for what had happened. A private investigator reported that their lives had turned into an endless series of scandals, and everything they once loved in their comfort had disappeared. Meanwhile, I was thinking about what to do next. I quit my part-time job at a real estate agency, and my father offered to help me with the family business. I got a job managing his resort real estate company, and living in this new place seemed like a refreshing change to me. Nature, silence, and tranquility, this was what I was looking for. I also got an alum dog, and now, when I looked into her kind eyes, I realized that this was the kind of life I needed. Nothing else mattered anymore.